I checked my GPS coordinates against the trail marker, confirming I was exactly where the maintenance log said I should be. 3 years of working Yellowstone's backcountry had taught me to trust the numbers more than my sense of direction, especially out here in the thoroughfare region, where everything looked the same after a while. Pine trees, rocky ground, and the occasional creek cutting through valleys that went on forever. The morning patrol had been routine so far. I'd replaced 2 damaged trail signs, cleared some fallen branches from the main hiking route, and documented a few spots where recent rainfall had washed out sections of the path. Standard ranger work that kept visitors safe and the wilderness maintained. My radio had been quiet for the past 2 hours, which usually meant everyone else was handling their sectors without problems. I shouldered my pack and headed toward the next checkpoint near one of the Yellowstone River's smaller tributaries. The sound of running water grew louder as I went down into a narrow valley, and I could smell the earthy dampness that always hung around these mountain streams. According to my route map, there should be another trail marker about a quarter-mile ahead, right where the creek bent around a cluster of large boulders. But when I rounded those boulders, I stopped walking. 20 feet in front of me was something I'd never seen before. A perfect circle of dead ground, blackened and lifeless, cut into the earth like someone had drawn it with a compass. The patch measured exactly 20 feet across, and the soil inside looked burned to ash. Not a single blade of grass remained within that boundary. I walked closer, pulling off my pack to get a better look. The edge was so precise it might have been cut with a knife. Healthy green vegetation grew right up to an invisible line, then abruptly stopped. Inside the circle, the earth was completely barren, colored a deep charcoal black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. My first thought was wildfire, but that didn't make sense. There were no scorch marks on the surrounding trees, no evidence of flames having touched anything beyond this exact circular area. The grass outside the ring wasn't even singed. Whatever had happened here had been contained to this precise spot with surgical accuracy. I knelt down and touched the blackened soil. It felt normal, neither hot nor cold, but it crumbled differently than regular dirt, almost like ash, but grittier. I pulled out my camera and started taking pictures from multiple angles, making sure to capture the sharp contrast between the dead circle and the living forest around it. The coordinates went into my GPS unit, along with detailed notes about the size, appearance, and location. I collected soil samples from inside the circle and from the healthy ground just outside it, sealing them in separate plastic bags and labeling them carefully. This kind of documentation was second nature after 3 years of ranger work, but I'd never had to document anything quite like this. No animal tracks crossed the dead zone. Even the insects seemed to avoid it. I spent 20 minutes walking around the perimeter, looking for any clue about what could have caused such a thing. Nothing. The circle existed in complete isolation, as if something had reached down from above and erased a perfect 20-foot patch of life. I radioed back to the station to let them know I'd be delayed, then spent another hour taking measurements and photographs. The whole thing bothered me in a way I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just the strangeness of it, but the precision. Nature didn't work in perfect circles. By the time I finished my documentation and hiked back to my ATV, the afternoon was getting late. The drive back to Thoroughfare Ranger Station took 40 minutes through winding mountain roads, and I spent most of it thinking about what I'd found. I'd seen lightning strikes kill trees, disease wipe out sections of forest, and various natural things leave their marks on the landscape. This was different. This felt deliberate. Robert Mitchell was at his desk when I walked into the station, reviewing paperwork with the methodical attention he brought to everything. He looked up when I entered, taking in my dusty clothes and the evidence bags I carried. "Find something interesting out there, Dave." I set the soil samples on his desk and pulled out my camera. "You could say that." I found a circular patch of dead ground near the southeastern tributaries, 20 feet across, perfectly round. All the vegetation inside is completely dead, but everything outside the circle is fine. Robert's expression didn't change as he looked at the photos on my camera's display screen. He scrolled through them slowly, looking at each image with the same neutral attention he'd give to a routine maintenance report. "Looks unusual," he said, handing the camera back to me. I waited for more, but he just turned back to his paperwork. "That's it? Just unusual? What do you want me to say, Dave? You found some dead ground. File your report. But don't you think we should investigate? I've never seen anything like this before. The precision of it, the way it's contained to that exact area." Robert looked up at me again, and for just a moment, something passed across his face. Not surprise or confusion, but something else. Recognition, maybe. Like he was remembering something he'd rather forget. "File the report," he repeated. "I'll make sure it gets to the right people." He opened a desk drawer and pulled out a standard incident form, sliding it across to me. His movements were efficient, practiced, like he'd done this before. I filled out the paperwork while Robert went back to his own work, occasionally looking at me over his reading glasses. The form asked for standard information: location, time of discovery, physical description, potential hazards. There was a section for probable cause that I left blank. What was I supposed to write? Unknown circular death zone? When I finished, I handed the form back to Robert. He looked it over briefly, then filed it in a folder I didn't recognize. "Is that going to headquarters?" I asked. "It'll go where it needs to go. But shouldn't someone come out to investigate? Take more samples? Maybe bring in a specialist?" Robert closed the folder and met my eyes directly. "Dave, you've been doing good work out here. Don't complicate it by worrying about things that are above your pay grade." The dismissal was clear, but it didn't satisfy me. Above my pay grade? I'm a park ranger. Documenting unusual things in the park is literally my job. Your job is maintaining trails, helping visitors, and keeping people safe. You did that today. You found something, you documented it, you reported it. Now let other people handle the rest. He turned back to his computer screen, ending the conversation. I stood there for another moment watching him type, clearly waiting for me to leave. I walked out of the station more confused than when I'd walked in. Robert's reaction made no sense. Any supervisor I'd ever worked with would have been asking detailed questions, maybe even wanting to see the site for himself. Instead, he'd acted like finding a mysterious circle of dead ground was routine paperwork. The drive home to my cabin took me past the turnoff that led back toward the southeastern tributaries. I slowed down, looking at the dirt road that would take me back to that strange circle. Part of me wanted to go back, to take more pictures, to try to understand what I'd found. But Robert's words bounced around in my head, above my pay grade, as if there were things happening in this park that rangers weren't supposed to know about. I kept driving toward home, but the image of that perfect circle stayed with me. 20 feet of dead earth, cut from the landscape with impossible precision, and my supervisor's knowing eyes when he'd looked at the photographs, like he'd seen something similar before. 2 years had passed since I found that first circle, and the image still came back to me every time I went out on patrol. What I didn't expect was finding more of them. The second one appeared near Shoshone Lake during a routine water quality check in late spring. I'd been walking the shoreline, taking samples and documenting wildlife activity, when I spotted the familiar blackened patch through a gap in the lodgepole pines. 20 feet across, perfectly circular, with that same weird precision that made my skin crawl. I went through the same documentation process: photographs, GPS coordinates, soil samples, detailed measurements. The earth looked identical to the first site: charcoal black, lifeless, contained within an invisible boundary that nature seemed to respect with surgical accuracy. No animal tracks crossed it. Even the insects gave it a wide berth. Robert's reaction was exactly what I'd expected. He looked at my photos with that same neutral expression, filed my report in that same mysterious folder, and told me to focus on my regular duties. When I pressed him about getting specialists involved, he gave me the same line about things being above my pay grade. The third circle turned up in Hayden Valley 3 months later. I'd been checking on bison migration patterns when I found it tucked between 2 small hills, hidden from the main tourist routes. Same dimensions, same blackened earth, same weird precision. By then, I'd started carrying a measuring tape specifically for these discoveries. 20 feet, down to the inch, every single time. My documentation had become more thorough with each find. I took soil samples from multiple points within each circle, measured the exact boundaries, and photographed everything from different angles and lighting conditions. I even started noting the time of day, weather conditions, and any unusual wildlife behavior in the area. Not that Robert seemed to care about any of it. The fourth circle appeared along Pelican Creek during a late summer patrol. I'd been following the creek bed, checking for signs of erosion after recent storms, when I found it tucked into a meadow about 50 yards from the water. The discovery felt routine by then, which bothered me more than the mystery itself. How had I become used to finding impossible patches of dead earth? Each report went into Robert's filing system with the same bureaucratic efficiency. Each time I asked questions, I got the same dismissive responses. The whole thing was starting to feel like a game where only I didn't know the rules. That's when I decided to do some research on my own. The park archives at Mammoth Hot Springs contained decades of ranger reports, maintenance logs, and incident documentation. I spent my days off digging through boxes of files, looking for any mention of circular dead zones or similar phenomena. What I found made my growing suspicions feel justified. References to strange circular patterns dated back to the 1960s. Rangers had been documenting these things for decades, always in carefully neutral language that avoided speculation about causes. But here's what really got my attention. Every report I found had sections blacked out with heavy marker, sometimes entire paragraphs, made unreadable. One file from 1987 mentioned periodic surface manifestations requiring standard documentation protocols. Another from 1994 referenced ongoing monitoring of designated grid coordinates. The language was bureaucratic and vague, but it suggested these circles weren't random discoveries. Someone was expecting them. I tried to access digital records, thinking maybe older files had been scanned without the redactions. No luck. The computer system required clearance levels I didn't have, and when I asked about getting access, I was told that historical research wasn't part of my job description. The veteran rangers were even less helpful than the files. I'd worked with some of these guys for 3 years, shared coffee and trail stories, considered them mentors. But the moment I brought up the circles, their attitudes completely changed. Jerry Martinez, who'd been working Yellowstone for 15 years, just shook his head when I described my findings. "Dave, sometimes it's better not to ask too many questions. You do your job, file your reports, let other people worry about the big picture." When I pressed him about whether he'd ever seen anything similar, he got uncomfortable and changed the subject to baseball. Sandra Knox, a 20-year veteran, was even more direct. "Look, kid, every ranger finds weird stuff out there. Document it, report it, move on. That's the job. But don't you want to know what causes them? She looked at me like I'd asked a particularly stupid question. "Want to know?" "Sure. Need to know?" "Not my department." The pattern was consistent across every veteran ranger I talked to. They'd acknowledged that strange things happened in the park, but they all seemed to have made peace with not understanding them, like they'd been trained to accept mystery as part of the landscape. My fifth discovery came in the Lamar Valley backcountry, deep enough into the wilderness that most tourists never made it that far. I'd been checking on a remote weather monitoring station when I found it in a clearing surrounded by massive Douglas firs. The circle looked exactly like all the others. 20 feet of blackened earth, precise boundaries, complete absence of life. I was kneeling next to it, taking my usual measurements, when I heard voices approaching through the trees. 2 rangers were hiking toward the weather station, their conversation carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "Containment protocols need to be updated," one of them was saying. "The frequency is increasing." "Has management made a decision about reclassification?" the other replied. I recognized both voices. Tom Richardson and Mike Santos, both senior rangers with more than 10 years of experience each. I stayed low behind a large boulder, listening as they got closer. "Not yet. They're still hoping the current approach will hold. And if it doesn't, then we implement the contingency plan." They were close enough now that I could hear their footsteps on the rocky ground. I pressed myself against the boulder, hoping they wouldn't notice my ATV parked near the weather station. "Speaking of which," Tom said, "did you see that the new guy found another one?" "Thompson?" "Yeah, I saw his report come through. Kid's persistent, I'll give him that." "Maybe too persistent. Someone should have a talk with him." "Robert's handling it. Dave's a good ranger, just needs to learn when to stop asking questions." Their voices disappeared as they continued toward the weather station. I waited until I couldn't hear them anymore before coming out from behind the boulder. My hands were shaking as I packed up my equipment. Containment protocols, reclassification, contingency plans. This wasn't the language of confused rangers trying to understand natural phenomena. This was the language of people managing a known situation. I drove back to the thoroughfare station with my mind racing. The conversation I'd overheard confirmed what I'd suspected for months. These circles weren't mysterious accidents of nature. They were something the Park Service knew about, had protocols for, and was actively managing. Which meant Robert's dismissive attitude wasn't ignorance, it was policy. That night I called in sick and drove back to the Lamar Valley site. I wanted to see the circle again, to look for details I might have missed during my official documentation. But when I got there, something was different. The area around the circle had been disturbed. Fresh boot prints in the soft earth. Tire tracks from a vehicle much larger than my ATV. Someone had been there after me, and they'd done more than just look around. Small flags marked various points around the perimeter, and there were tiny holes in the ground where soil samples had been taken. Someone else was studying these circles, with equipment and resources I didn't have access to. While I was being told to file reports and stop asking questions, another team was conducting detailed investigations. I knelt down and checked out the boot prints more carefully. They were made by heavy work boots, the kind that came with steel toes and reinforced soles. Not standard Ranger issue. The tire tracks showed a tread pattern I didn't recognize, definitely not from any Park Service vehicle I'd seen. I took photos of everything: the boot prints, tire tracks, the small sampling holes, the colored flags. If there was a cover-up happening, I wanted evidence of it. The drive back to my cabin took me past all the locations where I'd found circles over the past 2 years. Every site was remote, hidden from main tourist routes, accessible only to rangers and serious backcountry hikers. But now I wondered if that remoteness was intentional. Maybe these circles didn't just happen to be in isolated areas. Maybe they were placed there deliberately. Back home, I spread out topographical maps and marked every circle location with red pins. The pattern wasn't random. The sites formed a rough line running northeast to southwest across the park, spaced roughly 15 to 20 miles apart, like waypoints along some invisible route. I sat at my kitchen table until well past midnight, staring at those red pins and thinking about everything I'd discovered. The circles themselves, the redacted files, the uncomfortable reactions from veteran rangers, the overheard conversation about containment protocols, the evidence of secret investigations. Whatever was creating these circles, the Park Service knew about it. They had procedures for dealing with it, teams for studying it, and policies for keeping rangers like me in the dark about it. Which raised the obvious question: what were they trying to hide? I'd found 5 circles in 2 years, each one identical to the last. The vegetation never returned. Wildlife continued to avoid them. And somewhere in the bureaucratic machinery of the National Park Service, people who knew the truth were filing my reports in folders I'd never see again. The conspiracy of silence was real, and I was tired of being part of it. I was checking trail conditions along the Mirror Plateau when I caught the smell. It hit me before I saw anything, sharp and bitter, like plants that had been poisoned rather than burned. 3 years of finding these circles had taught me to recognize their signature, but this was different, stronger, more immediate. I followed the smell through a stand of lodgepole pines until I found what I was looking for. Another circle, 20 feet across, with that same impossible precision I'd come to expect. But this one made me stop and stare. The plants were still dying. I knelt at the edge, studying what I'd never seen before. The grass inside the boundary was wilted but still green, curled and twisted as if it had been hit by some invisible force. Leaves on the few bushes that had been caught in the circle hung limp and off color, but they hadn't turned that familiar charcoal black yet. Whatever had created this circle had happened recently, within the last day or two, maybe less. I pulled out my camera and started documenting, but my hands were shaking slightly. After 2 years of finding these things in their final state, black earth, lifeless and sterile, I was looking at one in the process of happening. The bitter smell burned my nostrils as I moved around the outside, taking photos from multiple angles. The dying plants told a story the older circles couldn't. Plants had been killed quickly, but not instantly. Whatever force created these circles didn't just erase life, it drained it, dried it up from the inside out. The grass looked like it had been hit by intense radiation or some kind of chemical that attacked cellular structure. I was halfway around the circle when I noticed something else that made my pulse quicken. In the exact center of the dying ground was a hole, not a natural depression or animal burrow, but a perfectly round opening in the earth, no larger than a pencil. I approached it carefully, the smell growing stronger with each step. The hole's edges were smooth and clean, as if they'd been cut by precision machinery. No loose dirt surrounded it, no signs of digging. It simply existed, drilled into the exact center of the circle with mechanical accuracy. I knelt beside the hole and tried to peer into it, but I couldn't see the bottom. The opening went straight down into darkness that seemed to swallow any light that entered. I pulled my flashlight from my belt and clicked it on, pointing the beam down the narrow shaft. The light disappeared completely, as if the hole was deeper than my flashlight could reach. I adjusted the angle, trying to catch any reflection or hint of the bottom, but the beam just vanished into what looked like an endless void. The air around the hole felt wrong, colder than the rest of the circle, with an electric quality that made the hair on my arms stand up. When I leaned closer, I could feel a faint current of air moving upward from the depths, carrying with it a metallic taste that coated the back of my throat. I sat back on my heels, processing what I was seeing. 5 previous circles, all in their final state of blackened death. Now this, fresh, recent, still in the process of killing everything within its boundaries, and for the first time, a direct opening into whatever lay beneath. This wasn't just another circle to document and report. This was evidence of active creation, proof that something was still happening here. The hole represented access to whatever force was responsible for these patches of death scattered across Yellowstone. I checked my watch. My patrol route would take me back past the thoroughfare station in 3 hours. Robert would expect my usual report, my usual photos, my usual compliance with his dismissive attitude. But this discovery changed things. The hole changed everything. I stood up and walked around the circle again, studying the dying plants and that precise opening in the center. Whatever was down there had just created this circle, recent enough that the grass was still wilting, still clinging to the last bits of life. If I reported this immediately, whatever investigation team had left those boot prints at the Lamar Valley site would probably be here before nightfall. But if I investigated first, gathered evidence on my own terms, maybe I could finally get some real answers instead of bureaucratic deflection. I pulled out my measuring tape and confirmed what I already knew: 20 feet across, down to the inch. The hole measured exactly 3/4 of an inch in diameter. Both measurements were too precise to be natural, too perfect to be accidental. The smell of dying plants grew stronger as the afternoon progressed. I could actually watch some of the grass curling further inward, the wilting process continuing in real time. Whatever had been unleashed here was still working, still draining life from everything within the circle's boundary. I took soil samples from various points, noting how the earth near the hole felt different under my hands. Looser, somehow changed at a molecular level. The dirt closer to the edge was still normal, but as I moved toward the center, the soil became increasingly strange, as if it had been hit by intense heat or chemical treatment. My radio crackled with routine check-ins from other rangers. Normal patrol updates, wildlife sightings, maintenance reports. The everyday business of managing a national park while something impossible was happening right under our feet. I stared down into that perfect hole again, watching my flashlight beam disappear into darkness. Somewhere far below, something had the power to reach up and kill plants in precise patterns, something that left access points drilled with mechanical precision. The veteran rangers knew about this. Robert knew about this. Management had protocols for this. But none of them were going to tell me the truth. If I wanted answers, I'd have to find them myself. I shouldered my pack and headed back toward my ATV, leaving the dying circle behind. But I wasn't driving back to the station. Not yet. I needed to gather more equipment, tools that would let me investigate that hole properly. For the first time in 3 years, I had access to whatever was creating these circles while it was still active. I wasn't going to waste the opportunity by filing another report that would disappear into Robert's mysterious folder. This time, I was going to find out what was really happening in Yellowstone. I needed something long enough to reach the bottom of that hole. 20 yards from the circle, a fallen lodgepole pine had left several straight branches scattered across the forest floor. I picked the longest one, maybe 8 feet of smooth wood, thick as my wrist and strong enough to handle some weight. I tested it by pressing down on one end while holding the other, strong enough for what I had in mind. Back at the circle, the sharp smell had gotten stronger. More plants had died in the time I'd been gone. The grass now completely limp and starting to turn that yellow color that came before the final blackening. Whatever process had been started here was speeding up. I stood at the edge of the hole, holding the branch near its thicker end. The opening looked even more exact up close. Perfectly round, edges so clean they might have been cut with industrial equipment. No natural force created holes like this. I lowered the stick into the darkness, feeding it down inch by inch. 3 feet, 5 feet, 7 feet. The branch disappeared into the void with no resistance, just empty space going down into the earth. I kept feeding more length into the hole, my grip moving closer to the tip as I ran out of branch to hold. 12 feet, 14 feet. I was almost at the end of the stick when it suddenly stopped. The impact sent a sharp vibration up through the wood and into my hands, not the soft resistance of hitting dirt or rock, but something hard and solid. I adjusted my grip and tapped the stick against whatever lay at the bottom. Clang. The sound was clear, metal hitting metal, sharp and ringing, coming up from the depths with the clear tone of steel hitting steel. I tapped again, harder this time, and got the same metallic response. 15 feet down, something manufactured waited in the darkness. I was still processing this discovery when the ground beneath my feet moved. The vibration started as a low tremor, barely noticeable through the soles of my boots, but it built quickly, spreading outward from the hole in waves that I could feel in my bones. The earth around the circle began to shake with increasing violence, and a deep rumbling sound rose from somewhere far below. I dropped the stick and scrambled backward as the tremor became a full earthquake. The rumbling grew louder, no longer just felt but heard. A grinding mechanical roar that seemed to come from directly underneath the hole. Something massive was moving down there, something that had been sleeping until I'd woken it up with a piece of deadfall. The sound was wrong for anything natural. This wasn't the crack and groan of moving rock or the bubble and hiss of geothermal activity. This was machinery, huge, complex, powerful machinery grinding to life after lying silent for who knew how long. Gears the size of truck tires turning for the first time in decades. Engines built to move mountains coughing back to consciousness. I kept backing away as the ground bucked and rolled beneath me. The dying plants in the circle whipped back and forth, and I could hear trees creaking as the tremor spread through the forest. The metallic roaring from below grew deafening, a sound like a factory floor amplified 100-fold and buried under tons of earth and rock. Fear flooded through me as I realized what I'd done. I hadn't just found evidence of something artificial beneath Yellowstone. I'd woken it up. Whatever had been sleeping down there was responding to my intrusion, coming back online after years of being shut down. The circles weren't just markers or access points. They were warning signs, boundaries around something that was never supposed to be disturbed. The rumbling continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. Then, as suddenly as it had started, everything went quiet. The ground stopped shaking. The mechanical roar faded to silence. Even the normal forest sounds seemed muted, as if the wildlife was holding its breath. I stood frozen at the edge of the dying circle, staring at the hole that had just connected me to something impossible. 15 feet down, metal infrastructure waited in the darkness. Infrastructure that could respond to contact, that could turn on systems buried beneath one of America's most beautiful wilderness areas. I turned and ran back toward my ATV. Every step felt unsteady, partly from the tremor still vibrating through my legs and partly from the adrenaline now flooding my system. Behind me, the hole remained silent, but I could feel it like a presence at my back, an opening to depths that contained secrets no park ranger was supposed to discover. The ATV started on the first try, and I gunned it harder than necessary, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever I'd awakened. The engine noise felt reassuring after the mechanical roaring from below. Something normal and understandable in a situation that had just become completely impossible. As I navigated the trail back toward Thoroughfare Station, My mind raced faster than the ATV's engine. Something artificial was buried under Yellowstone. Something massive and complex, built with enough sophistication to detect surface contact and respond with automated systems. The circles marked locations where this buried infrastructure occasionally broke through the surface, killing plants in perfect geometric patterns. And I just triggered it. The implications crashed over me as I drove. The Park Service knew about this. Had to know. You couldn't hide something that large, that complex, without cooperation from the people managing the land above it. The dismissive attitudes, the classified files, the protocols I'd overheard. They weren't managing a natural phenomenon. They were sitting on top of the biggest cover-up in government history. 20 minutes of hard driving brought me within sight of the thoroughfare station. I could see Robert's truck parked outside, light spilling from the office windows. In a few minutes, I'd be standing in front of him, with evidence that couldn't be dismissed or filed away. Evidence that whatever lay beneath Yellowstone was still active, still capable of responding to intrusion. I pulled up next to the building and killed the engine. For 3 years, Robert had been avoiding my questions and hiding the truth behind bureaucratic double talk. But now, I had proof that something artificial and massive was buried under the park we were supposed to be protecting. The conversation we were about to have would change everything. I burst through the station door without knocking, still shaken from the ATV ride back. The smell of coffee and old paperwork hit me, such a normal contrast to what I'd just experienced that it felt like stepping between two different worlds. Robert looked up from his desk, reading glasses perched on his nose, surrounded by the usual stack of maintenance reports and visitor incident forms. The picture of routine bureaucracy, exactly as I'd left him countless times before, but everything felt different now. Everything had changed in the last hour. Robert, I need to talk to you. Now. My voice came out harder than I'd intended, but I was past caring about protocol. 3 years of dismissive responses and bureaucratic deflection had just been shattered by the sound of machinery roaring to life 15 feet underground. He set down his pen and looked at me with that known neutral expression, the one I'd seen every time I'd brought him photos of circles. What's the problem, Dave? I found another circle, fresh one, near Mirror Plateau. But this time there was a hole in the center. A perfectly round hole, straight down into the earth. Robert's expression didn't change, but I caught something in his eyes. A flicker of attention that was different from his usual polite interest. He leaned back in his chair, hands folded across his stomach. And I put a stick down the hole. 15 feet down, it hit metal. When I tapped it, something woke up down there. The words spilled out of me, adrenaline still running through my system as I went over the moment again. The whole ground started shaking, Robert. Not like an earthquake, like machinery. Huge machinery, starting up after being shut down for years. Something massive and artificial is buried under this park, and you know about it. For the first time in 3 years, Robert's carefully kept composure broke. His face went pale, and he sat forward quickly, his hands holding the edge of his desk. The neutral mask he'd worn through dozens of my reports disappeared, replaced by something I'd never seen before. Real alarm. You put something down the hole? A stick, a branch from a fallen tree. It hit metal and... Robert was already moving, shoving back from his desk and reaching for the radio mounted on the wall behind him. His fingers fumbled with the controls for a second before he found the right channel, his movements urgent in a way that made my stomach clench. Base, this is Thoroughfare Station. I need to speak with command immediately. The radio crackled with static before a crisp voice responded. Thoroughfare, this is Base, go ahead. Robert's voice was tense, clipped, using language I'd never heard from him before. "We have a Category 5 disturbance at Grid 7 Alpha. Repeat, Category 5 disturbance. Surface contact was made with primary access point approximately 30 minutes ago." My blood turned to ice. Category 5 disturbance. Grid 7 Alpha. These weren't Park Service terms. This was military language. Operational codes that suggested Robert wasn't just a ranger supervisor filing routine reports. The casual bureaucrat I'd known for 3 years had just shown himself as something else entirely. The response from headquarters came swift and chilling. "Understood, Thoroughfare. Start evacuation protocol immediately. Proceed with the containment plan. How copy?" "Copy base. Initiating now." Robert hung up the radio and turned to face me, his expression grim. The man who had spent years dismissing my discoveries was gone, replaced by someone who clearly understood the magnitude of what had just happened. "What the hell is a containment plan?" I demanded. "What's Grid 7 Alpha? Why do we need to evacuate?" Robert ignored my questions and moved to a file cabinet I'd never paid attention to before, pulling out keys and unlocking the bottom drawer. Inside were supplies I'd never seen in a ranger station: emergency rations, water purification tablets, military-grade radio equipment, and what looked like emergency beacon transmitters. "Pack your gear, Dave. Everything essential. We've got maybe 2 hours before extraction." "Extraction? Robert, what is going on? What did I just wake up down there?" He continued pulling equipment from the cabinet, his movements quick and practiced. This wasn't the first time he'd done this. The evacuation protocol was something he'd prepared for, trained for, maybe even executed before. "Pack your gear," he repeated, not looking at me. "Personal items, any documentation you want to keep, emergency supplies from your kit. Leave everything else." The radio crackled again. "All personnel clear the area within 2 hours. Repeat, all personnel clear the area within 2 hours." I grabbed Robert's arm, forcing him to face me. "You're going to tell me what's happening, right now. I've been finding these circles for 3 years, and you've been lying to me about what they are. I just triggered something 15 feet underground that sounded like a factory starting up, and now we're evacuating. What is buried under this park?" Robert met my eyes, and for the first time since I'd known him, his expression held no deflection, no bureaucratic distance, just resignation and something that looked like regret. "You've been working above something that should never be disturbed. Now that you have, we have to leave before it fully wakes up." "What kind of something?" He turned away and continued gathering supplies, but his voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. "The kind that makes Category 5 disturbances require immediate evacuation of all surface personnel within a 50-mile radius." The implications hit me hard. Surface personnel. Whatever was down there wasn't just big. It was dangerous enough to clear half the park when it showed signs of activity. The circles weren't natural phenomena or even simple access points. They marked the boundaries of something that could threaten everything above it. "How long have you known?" "Long enough to understand why you needed to stop asking questions." Robert lifted an emergency pack over his shoulder and headed for the door. "Helicopter pickup in 90 minutes at the emergency landing zone near Yellowstone Lake. Move, Dave. Whatever you woke up down there, we don't want to be here when it decides to come looking for what bothered it." The radio made noise one final time. "All personnel clear the area within 2 hours." I looked at the equipment scattered across Robert's desk, at the emergency supplies he'd hidden in plain sight for 3 years, at the man who had just admitted to lying about everything I'd found since I started working in this park. 50 miles of evacuation zone. Military protocols. Something buried that could wake up and threaten the surface. I'd wanted answers, And now I was getting them. I just wasn't sure I was ready for what they meant. The emergency landing zone sat on a ridge overlooking Yellowstone Lake, marked by orange cones and emergency equipment that had clearly been positioned years ago. Robert drove us here in 30 minutes of tense silence, both of us checking our watches and looking around for rotors that hadn't appeared yet. I dropped my pack next to his and stared across the water toward the thermal features dotting the far shore. Normal Yellowstone, doing normal Yellowstone things. Tourists were probably still taking photos of Old Faithful right now, completely unaware that 50 miles away, something buried since the Cold War was grinding back to life underneath their feet. "You've got 20 minutes before pickup," Robert said, settling onto a fallen log. "Ask your questions." 3 years of deflection, and now he was volunteering information. I didn't know where to start. "How long have you known what's down there?" "Since my first day as supervisor. 7 years ago." Robert pulled off his ranger hat and ran fingers through his graying hair. "Part of the briefing when you reach management level. Not the whole truth, but enough to understand why certain protocols exist." "What kind of protocols?" "Document every circle. File reports through specific channels. Never let surface personnel investigate too deeply. Maintain normal park operations while monitoring for signs of underground activity." He gestured toward the radio clipped to his belt. "Report anything unusual immediately to people who aren't officially Park Service." That explained the mysterious folder, the dismissive responses, the way veteran rangers had warned me to stop asking questions. They'd all been part of a monitoring system disguised as routine bureaucracy. "The circles," I said. "They're not random. Access points, ventilation systems, emergency exits." Robert's voice carried the flat tone of someone reciting memorized facts. "The facility below covers most of the park's southeastern quadrant. When internal pressure builds up or automated systems activate, they vent through surface openings, usually just releases harmless gas that kills vegetation in perfect geometric patterns." Usually? Usually? He met my eyes. "Sometimes the venting process gets triggered by external contact, probing, vibration, direct interference with the access mechanisms." The stick. My wooden stick tapping against metal 15 feet down had been enough to turn on old systems that had been quiet for decades. I'd literally poked a sleeping giant with a tree branch. "What kind of facility?" Robert was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Cold War experimental research. Technologies that were too dangerous for surface testing. The kind of research that got shut down when people realized what they were playing with." "What kind of technologies?" "The kind that required burying the entire operation under a national park and posting guards disguised as rangers to make sure nothing ever woke it up again." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "How big is it down there?" "Big enough that your little disturbance could trigger a cascade failure across multiple grid sections. Big enough that when something goes wrong, they evacuate a 50-mile radius and hope containment protocols hold." The radio on Robert's belt crackled. "Helicopter inbound. 10 minutes to landing zone." I checked my watch. Right on schedule. Whatever was happening below had been expected, prepared for, planned around. This wasn't the first evacuation. "How many times has this happened before?" "Twice in my tenure. Both times, underground systems activated for a few hours, vented some pressure, then went dormant again. Both times we evacuated surface personnel and waited to see if the facility would stabilize on its own." "Did it?" Robert nodded toward the radio. "We're here, so yes. But this time feels different. Your contact was direct, sustained. You actually made it respond to surface intrusion." That's when I heard it. A low rumbling from the direction of Mira Plateau, barely audible over the wind, but definitely there. The same mechanical grinding I'd triggered with my stick, but distant now, muffled by miles of rock and earth. Robert heard it too. His hand moved to the radio, then stopped. No point calling it in. Command already knew what was happening. Look, he pointed southeast, toward the backcountry where I'd spent 3 years documenting mysterious circles. Steam was rising from the forest. Not the normal wisps from thermal features, but thick columns of white vapor shooting up from multiple points across the landscape like industrial smokestacks. I counted 7 distinct plumes climbing into the afternoon sky, each one marking what I now knew was an access point to whatever lay buried beneath our feet. Emergency venting, Robert said. The underground systems are purging pressure buildup through every available surface outlet. That's good. Means containment is still functional. And if containment fails? The helicopter showed up over the lake before he could answer, rotors beating the air as it got closer to our landing zone. Military aircraft, not park service. Black paint, no visible markings, the kind of machine that didn't officially exist in government records. As the pilot sat down on the flat ground beside us, I watched more steam columns rise from the forest. 8 now. 9. The entire southeastern section of Yellowstone was venting like a pressure cooker, releasing whatever had been building up below since the last time someone had been stupid enough to probe an access hole with a stick. Robert shouldered his pack and headed for the helicopter. But I stood there, looking at the steam rising from America's first national park. Everything I'd believed about this place, pristine wilderness, natural wonders, geological marvels, had been a carefully constructed cover story. "Dave!" Robert shouted over the rotor noise. "Move!" I grabbed my pack and ran for the aircraft, but my mind was spinning with what this all meant. Yellowstone wasn't a park. It was a burial ground for Cold War secrets, staffed with guards who had no idea their real job was to keep civilians away from experimental technology that should never have been built in the first place. The helicopter lifted off as more steam columns shot up across the landscape below. Through the window, I could see the perfect geometric patterns I'd been documenting for 3 years, now clearly deliberate markings across a massive underground complex that stretched beneath thousands of acres of protected wilderness. The pilot banked northwest, carrying us away from whatever was stirring in the depths. Behind us, the forest continued venting pressure through access points that tourists would never see, releasing the mechanical breath of something that had been sleeping under America's most famous natural treasure since before I was born. Robert was right. Yellowstone's greatest danger wasn't its volcanic activity. It was the buried secrets that the government would do anything to keep hidden beneath the surface of our first national park.